Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The balance of power in Congress is still up in the air after Democratic candidates outperformed expectations in much of the country in Tuesday's midterm elections. With ballots still being counted in many key races, it remains unclear which party will control the Senate or the House. In one of the most closely watched Senate races, Pennsylvania Democrat John Fetterman has declared victory over his Trump-backed challenger, Dr. Mehmet Oz, to fill the Senate seat held by Republican Pat Toomey. Fetterman's election victory came 6 months after suffering a stroke just before the Democratic primary. He addressed supporters early this morning.
I'm proud of what we ran on, protecting a woman's right to choose, raising our minimum wage, fighting the union way of life. Healthcare is a fundamental human right. It saved my life, and it should all be there for you when you ever should need it.
Control of the Senate now rests on 4 states: Wisconsin, Georgia, Arizona, and New Mexico. In Georgia, it appears increasingly likely the race between Democratic Senator Raphael Warnock and Republican Herschel Walker race will go to a runoff. With 95% of the vote counted, Warnock is leading with 49.4% of the vote, just shy of the 50% needed in Georgia to win the election outright. Walker has 48.5% of the vote. Warnock spoke to supporters early this morning.
Well, good evening, Georgia. Or maybe I should say good morning. Here's where we are. We are not sure if this journey is over tonight or if there's still a little work yet to do. But here's what we do know. We know that when they're finished counting the votes from today's election, that we're going to have received more votes than my opponent. We know that.
Again, control of the Senate now rests in 4 states: Wisconsin, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. In Wisconsin, Republican Senator Ron Johnson is in the lead over Wisconsin's Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes, but the race is still too close to call. In Nevada's Senate race, Republican Adam Laxalt is leading Democratic Senator Catherine Cortez Masto with 75% of the vote counted. In Arizona, Democratic Senator Mark Kelly has a 6-point lead over his Trump-backed challenger Blake Masters with 2/3 of the vote counted. In other key Senate races, in Ohio, Republican J.D. Vance defeated Democrat Tim Ryan, while in New Hampshire, Maggie Hassan beat her far-right challenger, General Don Bolduc. As for the House, more than 70 races have yet to be called, but many analysts are predicting Republicans will flip the House, but just by a small margin. One prominent Republican incumbent who might lose her seat is Lauren Boebert in Colorado. Early this morning, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said House Democratic candidates are, quote, outperforming expectations. In other key races, Florida governor and possible Republican 2024 presidential candidate Ron DeSantis easily won re-election. In Georgia, Republican Governor Brian Kemp defeated Democrat Stacey Abrams. In Pennsylvania's governor's race, Democrat Josh Shapiro trounced Doug Mastriano, the far-right election denier backed by Trump. In Wisconsin, Democratic Governor Tony Evers has been re-elected, while Republican state lawmakers in Wisconsin appear to have fallen short in their effort for a supermajority. Here in New York, Democratic Governor Kathy Hochul has defeated her Trump-backed challenger, Lee Zeldin. Hochul, who took office after Andrew Cuomo resigned, became the first woman elected as governor in New York. Massachusetts will also soon have its first woman governor with the election of Democrat Maura Healey. She'll also become the nation's first openly lesbian governor. In Vermont, Becca Balint has made history by becoming the first woman and first openly LGBTQ+ candidate in Vermont to be elected to Congress. Balint was elected to the House to fill the seat held by Peter Welch, who was elected to the Senate to replace Patrick Leahy. In Maryland, voters elected Democrat Wes Moore, who will become Maryland's first black governor. Meanwhile, in Arizona, Democrat Katie Hobbs is leading in the governor's race against Republican Kari Lake. In Arizona's closely watched Secretary of State race, Democrat Adrian Fontes is leading over Mark Fincham, one of numerous Republican election deniers running to oversee elections. CNN reports election deniers won Secretary of State races in Alabama, Indiana, South Dakota, and Wyoming. One of Tuesday night's big winners was abortion rights. Vermont, Michigan, and California all voted to enshrine the right to an abortion in their states' constitutions. In Kentucky, voters rejected a ballot measure that sought to amend the state constitution to say there is no right to abortion. State lawmakers have already passed a near-total ban on abortion in Kentucky, but the measure would have made challenging the ban even more difficult. In Montana, with over 80% of votes counted, it appears voters will reject a ballot measure which would establish that infants born alive at any stage of development are legal persons and criminalize health care providers. Meanwhile, voters in Maryland and Missouri voted to legalize recreational marijuana, while similar proposals failed in Arkansas and North Dakota. Several states had measures related to slavery on the ballot. Voters in Tennessee, Alabama, and Oregon and Vermont backed removing language from their constitutions that allows slavery as punishment. But in Louisiana, 2/3 of voters rejected a proposal that would have barred slave labor in prisons. In voting rights, Connecticut passed a measure allowing in-person early voting, and Michigan approved several pro-democracy measures, including opening polls for early voting and ballot drop boxes. But in a blow for voting rights, Nebraskans overwhelmingly supported requiring a photo ID to vote, and Ohio voters chose not to let residents who are not U.S. citizens cast ballots in local elections. Maine's largest city of Portland and Evanston, Illinois, have both backed measures to use ranked choice voting in city elections. In Nevada, a ballot measure to allow for open primaries and ranked choice voting has not been called yet, though yes votes lead by 3 percentage points. In labor news, Washington, D.C. approved Initiative 82, which phases out tipping and raises the minimum wage for tip service workers from $5.35 an hour to $16.10 an hour by 2027. At the UN Climate Summit in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, several European nations, including Ireland and Denmark, made modest pledges to fund loss and damage for poorer nations that are bearing the brunt of the climate disaster. Ursula von der Leyen, president of the European Commission, endorsed the move to include loss and damage as part of global efforts to combat climate change. Notably silent on the issue was the United States. Harjit Singh from the Climate Action Network said, quote, "The U.S. has for decades acted in bad faith with regards to loss and damage, but the delays and deception of real-life consequences the U.S. needs to change from being obstructive to constructive," he said. A new UN-backed report says the Global South needs at least $2 trillion a year to fight the climate crisis, and that half of that should come from rich countries, investors, and multilateral development banks. Meanwhile, some island nations, which are among the most vulnerable to climate change, have proposed a windfall tax on oil companies. Barbados Prime Minister Mia Mottley called for a 10% tax on oil companies. She spoke at COP27 Tuesday.
The wipeout events that are a risk for us as small states become a serious concern. We make the point all the time that large countries can be the subject of a climatic event and still survive. Small states do not have that luxury. And for many of us, the risk of a wipeout event is simply too great for us to carry.
As official meetings and speeches continue at COP27, pressure is mounting for the Egyptian government to take action as political prisoner human rights activist Alaa Abdel Fattah remains on a complete hunger and water strike. He stopped drinking water on Sunday. On Tuesday, UN's head of human rights warned his life is in great danger. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz also addressed the issue Tuesday.
It is very depressing to see how a human life is at risk, and the hunger strike has now entered a stage where we all have to fear that this will really lead to quite a dreadful consequence. That is why I, and I know many other heads of state and government, have raised this issue specifically. A decision needs to be taken, a release has to be made possible, so that it doesn't come to it that the hunger striker dies.
On Tuesday, Egyptian lawmaker Amr Darwish confronted Alaa Abdel Fattah's sister, Sana Saif, as she spoke to the press at COP. He asked Sana Saif, quote, "Are you here inciting foreign countries to put pressure on Egypt before being removed from the event by security?" President Biden is meeting later this week with Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. He's expected to raise human rights with Sisi. It's not clear if he will explicitly discuss Alaa Abdel Fattah. The United States and Russia have agreed to resume talks under the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or New START. The meetings have been on hold since before Russia invaded Ukraine in February. The only remaining nuclear treaty between the countries limits the number of deployed strategic nuclear warheads for each country as a deterrent to a new arms race and nuclear war. In Russia, the American WNBA star Brittany Griner is being transferred to a penal colony. The process could take up to 2 weeks. Her lawyers say they don't know where she will end up. Griner was sentenced to 9 years in prison for bringing a small amount of cannabis oil in her luggage into Russia. In Syria, a new report by Doctors Without Borders is denouncing the horrific conditions faced by refugee children at the overcrowded Al-Hol camp, describing it as a massive open-air prison and a death camp. Al-Hol is located in the northeast near the border with Iraq, houses about 60,000, mostly women and children, many younger than 12 years old. Refugees at Al-Hol say violence has intensified between armed groups and security forces and report arbitrary detentions, theft and extortion, rampant medical neglect. The report said some children died from prolonged delays in accessing urgent medical care. Young boys at the camp are also reportedly being forcibly taken from their mothers once they reach around 11 years old, never to be seen again. Meta, the parent company of Facebook, Instagram and WhatsApp, is laying off more than 11,000 workers, reducing its workforce by 13%. CEO Mark Zuckerberg announced the mass firings early today, blaming declining ad revenue and profits. It's the latest hit for tech workers after Twitter's new billionaire owner, Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, last week fired nearly 4,000 employees, half of Twitter's workforce. Florida's bracing for Tropical Storm Nicole, which is expected to make landfall late tonight or early Thursday north of West Palm Beach as a Category 1 hurricane, with torrential rain and damaging winds. Many residents are still reeling from the destruction left by Hurricane Ian in October. And in Mexico, anti-corruption officials are investigating the Attorney General's office in the state of Morelos, accusing it of covering up the femicide of 27-year-old Adriana Lopez, whose body was found by a highway last week. Morelos officials claim Lopez had died of alcohol intoxication. But during a news conference Monday, Mexico City's mayor, Claudia Sheinbaum, presented the results of a second autopsy that found Lopez had actually died of multiple force trauma. Sheinbaum also played security footage of a man in an apartment building parking garage carrying a body, which Sheinbaum alleged was Adriana Lopez. Last year alone, there were over 1,000 femicides reported in Mexico. This is activist Karina Vara.
We ask the authorities to work and give accurate, substantive results. We do not want declarations or statements. We demand justice and dignity. The state is femicide and re-victimizes with its actions. Its omissions build the path of impunity that our aggressors enjoy. The community is an accomplice. Men take our lives.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report.